give us Molly, perhaps I could have you introduce yourself.
Hello, I am Molly Vanderwater. I am the Vice President of the Queer Student Association over at the University of Winnipeg, and I'm here to bring the queer perspective on gender-based violence and the consideration of what it means to be a woman-identifying person dealing with these issues, and also to bring the perspective of literature and how it can impact in healing from gender-based violence. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Welcome, Molly. Thank you for joining us. Margaret, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Margaret. I work at the University of, actually out of the University of Winnipeg, but I work for an agency called Aurora Family Therapy Center. Mm-hmm. So I'm a clinician there, a therapist. We work with mostly people who are not born in Canada, who have been through, different kinds of trauma, mostly refugees. So war survivors and people have generally been displaced from their homes and who are trying to make a new living in a new country where they are foreigners, they don't speak the language, and there's just so many barriers. So I work with that group to just try and help them to settle well in Canada.
Perfect. Thank you. Welcome, Margaret. Janet.
Hi, my name is Janet Forbes. I'm the Executive Director at Inclusion Winnipeg, and our organization is part of a national federation. So there's an Inclusion Canada, and the purpose of our organization is to work for and with people who have intellectual disabilities to help them to be included in all aspects of their life alongside of their peers. And so we work with families of children, and we work with young adults and into later years around helping when there's problems, but also doing some creative things. And someone else mentioned storytelling, and we've just finished a project on storytelling because so many times people with intellectual disabilities have their story told by somebody else or their story stolen. So I get that part of it. Our connection to the gender-based violence came about through our partnership with an organization that was called Iris Institute, and just in the last few months they have changed their name to the New Society Institute, and the researchers there have done lots of work in partnership with organizations across the country around addressing the issue of the disability and marginalized women and people who identify as women, how it's so much greater, the risk that they're at and the harm that they experience is so much greater. So there's different things that are happening across the country in different cities, but one of the things that's kind of consistent is the local safety and inclusion network. So from Vancouver to the East Coast to Iqaluit, there are local safety networks that come together. The people who we want to have there are the folks that have the lived experience, that they have live that themselves, or the people who are closer to them. So we don't want to have a table of people like me, executive director, sitting there making decisions, but we really want to hear from the experiences. Some of the safety networks have really expanded, and they are starting to identify what they would need and what they would like in their community. So some of them are already working on a space, a place that they can go to and get all the services. We're not quite there yet, but we're on that. We're on that journey of listening to what people see. This is what we need in our community to keep us safe. So I'm happy to be here tonight. This is a really great opportunity. Thank you.
Terrific. Welcome, Janet, and welcome to you all. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think there's so much richness and variety in the experiences around the table, and it's always so helpful in having these kinds of conversations to bring varied perspectives to the table. And I think as we talk too, that we'll see where those commonalities are and across those intersections. So I'm looking forward to all of that. I want to start off with a little bit of perhaps a more general question. in working with Toufah on her book, she spoke, for those who don't know Toufah's backstory, Toufah was a young woman who grew up in the Gambia, who participated in a presidentially sponsored educational pageant. It was a pageant with the end goal of the winner getting access to an educational scholarship. So she participated in this presidential pageant, won the pageant, and was that pageant, in fact, was really an opportunity for the then president of the Gambia to assault young women, basically. And so Toufah was sexually assaulted in the aftermath of that pageant. She escaped to Senegal, then eventually was accepted as a refugee to Canada, came to Canada, and over time was able to participate in some efforts to bring Jammeh to justice and to speak out about what had happened to her. In her book, she talks about the challenges that she faced in being pressured to use the word allegedly around her sexual assault. That women who come forward often to talk about their experiences of gender-based violence are met with skepticism and are pressured to use words like allegedly. And I'm wondering if each of you can reflect a little bit on how language impacts the credibility of survivors and what changes we need to make it easier for survivors to speak about those experiences. And perhaps, Molly, maybe I can start with you if you could reflect on that a little bit.
I'd be happy to start. From my perspective, one of the most important things regarding language and regarding communication is to be open. You need to ensure that if you are, say, a professional or even just someone trying to help someone in your personal life, you need to ensure that you are emotionally available and you are open to discussion. And if you perhaps do anything wrong and if you take the wrong steps, you need to ensure that you are willing to move on and to reconsider. Because too often people think, oh, well, like, I don't really know what to do. I don't know how to handle the situation. It's best to just be willing to take criticism and to keep yourself available and to hear what personal perspectives you can. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Margaret, I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on the use of that word allegedly, from your perspective as someone who's working in counseling victims and survivors, what sort of impact it has for people when they're pushed to frame what happened to them with that sort of conditional phrase.
Just actually thinking about that, it's like when I read the book, that was a very powerful book. If people haven't read it, I highly recommend it. So when I read about this word alleged, that is actually, I think that's the language that is used, right? Like in all other contexts, when things happen, it's not about context. It's not about alleged. It's like people can accept that something happened, but when it comes to crime against women, yeah, like I remember you like went back from home when a woman tries to say something happened to me, they are met with why? As if there is ever a reason that will make it okay for a woman to be assaulted, right? It's what were you doing? Where were you going? So questions like those, like I think it shames the survivors and it makes it really hard for them to come out, because at the end of the day, you're being blamed for what happened to you. Mm-hmm. So I think that really affects the way that survivors deal with what happens to them, even the families, like I have some examples, maybe I'll share those later, but some of my clients are not able to talk about something that happened to them because the family decides to personalize that. You'll hear the parents, even the mothers, even the women in the family saying that, how could you let that happen to us? It's a shame. It's for a family. It's not so much about like, so how can we help you? How can we all survive this? It's about what you did to us.
Right.
So that really creates a lot of barriers for survivors. So and I think that's some of the places that the work is really great, that we need to reframe and change all this thinking and all this language around the treatment of people who have survived.
Right. Leslie, when you reflect on that kind of language and the shame that is attached to the language around sexual and gender-based violence, what sort of impact do you see that having on women and women identifying people in your community?
For sure. Thank you very much. Well, I believe that language plays a critical role in shaping the perceptions and the credibility of survivors and survivors of gender-based violence. When survivors are required to use terms like allegedly, it can diminish their experiences and suggest doubt about their claims. This skepticism that survivors endure reinforces societal stigmas and can also deter others from coming forward with their stories. So when survivors are coming and trying to tell their stories, as soon as we have language, as soon as language is presented to them in a way that victim blames and causes that stigma, then already you're building those barriers up for survivors to find the necessary resources and supports that they need.
Janet, what sort of impact do you see in your community in your community?
So when I knew this would be a question, and it was that how powerful words are. So my first thought was around alleged. It's like a "so you say" kind of thing, but it goes farther than that because it's also in some of our legislation. So we have in Manitoba, we have the Adult Abuse Registry, and someone who is has been proven that they have abused someone in many ways, sexual being one of them. They are referred to as the alleged offender. And so it's describing, and so if it can't be proven, if there's not enough evidence to prove that it happened in an abusive sort of way, that person doesn't have and the Adult Abuse Registry is a HR screening tool. But if they don't get to there, then does it stop them from being an offender because what they were alleged to have done wasn't proven? And I think that's those structural things that in language is so important, because it might just be a word, but it's a powerful, demeaning word for so many people. It's like, I don't really believe you. That's what you're saying, but we got to prove this. Yeah.
And there are other challenges in language as well, right? I mean, Toufah talks about in her book how in her language, in her home language, there wasn't even a word for rape, for that kind of sexual violence. And I'm wondering, Margaret, maybe if you could reflect a little bit on that in dealing with refugees and people from for whom English isn't a first language, that challenge of communicating what has happened when the words are not the same words.
Yeah, so I'd been thinking, after I read that book, I was thinking about what word do we have in my own language to describe rape, right? And I realized that we really don't have it. We have a word that sounds like touch. Or push. So yeah, it's not there. That language is not there. So, and that just reflects the way the community actually thinks and deals with it, right? Because if we cannot language it, then we cannot really do anything about it. If we can't language it, then it's probably isn't there, right? And I think this is culturally implanted in some of the traditions, and this is not just my own culture, but also the people that I meet, because some of them, like I deal with war survivors who have been, like, I think you know about Yazidi people, right? Like some of the girls and women were taken and they were forced, enslaved into sexual slavery and all that stuff. And yeah, the silence around what really happens, and not just with the victim, but also even within the family. Even for those who've gone through the same thing, they are not able to talk about this because there's really no language and there's really no place for it. And there is this thing of, let's just pray about it. It's God's will, like there's also that. So there's religion and there's culture, and it's all, unfortunately, continues to harm the survivors.
Leslie, is that something that you see as an issue in Indigenous culture as well? As are there the same kinds of language issues there?
Well, I'm not proficient in my language, unfortunately. I hope to one day be a language holder. But I did ask this question to a language speaker, my mom. So I asked, and we also don't have a specific term for the word rape. However, in the way that Cree is used, it's action-based. So something closest in terms of the word would be to fight or to hit. That's what we have in the Cree context, but I guess because of the situation here in Canada, majority of us are English speakers, so we do have that capacity to talk and speak and find resources and supports and help out in the community. But that cultural context of understanding, that's where we fall short. So when we go into a place seeking supports or resources, there's that lack of cultural understanding, which can be a detriment to health.
And of course, we can't presume that because there is a word for it, that there is agreement on what the word means, right? I mean, we have all of these words in the English language, and we still find ways to push the shame of those words onto the people who were assaulted, rather than to shift the shame of those words onto the people who did the assaulting, right? So, it's just having the words isn't necessarily always a fast track to the appropriate, the appropriate person carrying the shame of those words either, right? Leslie, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of sustainable practices that can be integrated into efforts to support survivors. You talked a little bit about the language issues and using English as a language entry point to that, but I'm wondering about sustainable practices that support survivors of violence in Indigenous communities.
For sure. Thank you very much. So sustainable practices to support survivors of violence in Indigenous communities must be rooted in cultural sensitivity, as well as community involvement and long-term commitment. I think some strategies that can be integrated would be like culturally relevant support services, which means to develop support programs that honor and integrate Indigenous cultural practices and values. There's also community-led initiatives to empower Indigenous communities to take the lead in designing and implementing support services through the Indigenous lens. This can enhance trust and ensure that solutions are relevant and effective for the people that they serve. Also to create education and awareness campaigns that inform communities about resources available for survivors of violence. This includes raising awareness about the impact of violence and promoting healthy relationships based on respect and support and mutual support. I also think that legal and advocacy support can establish partnerships, long-term sustainable partnerships with legal aid organizations to provide accessible legal resources for survivors. Unfortunately, due to our current system that we have for within the Indigenous community, a lot of times we see that Indigenous survivors don't have the capacity to find legal and advocacy supports, or when they do through legal aid, a lot of times legal aid doesn't have the capacity to help and inform survivors. So there's a lack of, well, unfortunately, the legal aid is they're at full capacity, and they have only limited time with their clientele. So if we were to provide further legal and advocacy supports for survivors, then we could definitely build on that capacity for the Indigenous community. But I would say lastly, developing collaborative partnerships within the community and working with existing Indigenous organizations and health services to create a more cohesive support network for survivors would definitely benefit everybody within our communities.
Perfect. Thanks, Leslie. Janet, you talked a little bit about surveying your community to ask what they needed, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your community's needs and the role of that community inclusion, particularly among disabled and racialized groups.
Mm-hmm. So I think that there's so many communities within this community that we have. And when, the history of our work working with people with intellectual disabilities, they often came to our attention because it was their family or someone close to them who was supporting them and needed help. We now are finding that there are a large number, and I don't have a percentage, I don't have an actual number to be able to apply, but people who kind of lived under the radar, that they for so many years our federal laws didn't allow people with intellectual disabilities to emigrate to Canada with their families. So that was new, that a lot of times it was because of people coming as refugees or from like Syria, war-torn countries, that they were coming here to Canada, and but they had that support to find a place to help them. We don't understand the needs of all of the communities, and it's the people who are living there. And the story of survival is pretty powerful, and that helping one another. But there's so many issues if someone if they're living in poverty, and so they don't have a home, that they're transient. If that's the case, and they may not be able to even apply for any kind of income assistance, or there's other things that are cutting them off. So when we say we look to community to include people, we have one vision of, a healthy community, including everybody, but that's just not the way it is. And people find their own communities, and sometimes those are very unsafe circles that they find in, because they do feel that they're there, but they're so vulnerable, and they sometimes are recruited or brought into that community for purposes of abusing them. Or we've just had a report recently done, and this is across the country, on the sexual slavery and trafficking in Canada, and how young people are lured into the sex industry, how they're provided with clothes and all these kind of things, and then in return for that they're going to be sexually abused. And there's a case in Winnipeg right now about a woman who groomed another young woman, and fortunately she had some support to be able to go through to the police. But it's only like they're within all those communities, there's such a hierarchy of who has control and who has power, and who's the most vulnerable with really no place else to go to. So I don't have an answer. Like, we're only beginning to meet people who are able to really help us to understand what it's like. So when we met with a group of young people, they said, we need some place that we can even do our laundry or have our things and they're not stolen. So a lot of people everything is taken from them, and then they are at the mercy of people who are there to harm them. And I don't know if that answers the question, but I said we don't have the answers yet, and that's why something like this is so important to have these conversations. And we feel as an organization, one of the things that we can do, if we can convene groups, if we can have people come together, and that's what we're seeing when we sort of, we had a safety network, a national safety network meeting here just 2 weeks ago. And just to hear the stories across the table and the nods of agreement, or when somebody pulls back when they hear something, that's the language of the community. So it is, again, it's just so great to be able to connect with people who see different things that are going on, and but the people themselves, they're the ones who have the stories, and it's just for some of the people, it's not were they ever sexually abused, raped, whatever the word is, or how young were they when the first time. And that's, it was, I can remember there's a person, David Hinsberger, who's passed now, who did a lot of work in this area. And I remember him telling the story of overhearing a conversation when these young women said, how old were you the first time you were raped? So it becomes something that is not an isolated event, and it's sometimes saving your life. So,
yeah, no, and that complexity of experience, but also trying to find ways to support in even really basic ways, as you were saying, that the opportunity to have someplace safe to do your laundry, you wouldn't necessarily put that at the top of the list of things that would create safety around gender violence, but if you don't have that level of safety, you have no safety, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Molly, can you talk a little bit? I know that you have an interest in and a connection to using creative writing and literature as a tool for healing, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, particularly in the queer community.
Well, one of the most important things regarding storytelling is that it can be freeing both for the people writing the stories and for the people reading the stories, because not only does it allow you to verbalize and process the emotions by putting it into words, it also allows you to share that experience and for other people to be able to understand and to be able to have something that reflects possibly their experience so they can feel seen and heard, especially in cases where people don't have a community around them that's nearby that they can reach out to. They can instead, at the very least, have literature that reflects their experiences and allows them to have a different perspective, and it allows them to have something they can reflect upon. Especially in queer communities, there making sure that there is literature available, that there are stories available is very important, especially considering the Millions March for Kids movement that happened last year and was continuing on this year, which, if you weren't aware, was a movement of people trying to ban books that were covering queer topics in schools. So because there's that pushback, because that kind of movement can happen, it is important to ensure that that literature is supported, and not only that, it is as available as it can be, so that the most people can read it. And if they feel ashamed, if they feel scared of talking, of reaching out, they can at the very least have a story that can reflect their experiences, and they can at the very least have that comfort. Or they can, at the very least, write their stories and be able to share that in a way that might be easier than saying it out loud. Yeah, I believe that sufficiently answers your question.
Great. Thank you, Molly. Thank you. Margaret, in your work as a therapist, you talked a little bit about the challenges even within families, right? Of some of that shame and blame being pushed back onto the survivor or the victim. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the kind of supportive role that loved ones can play, or how you can facilitate that conversation with victim and family to draw in some family support. Oh, Margaret, you're muted. Your microphone's muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, and I think we usually say that it takes a village to raise a child. I also believe that it takes a village to actually recover.
Mm.
And I think everybody is involved in this. So some of the things that we try to bring, first of all, is about normalizing like these things happen, and the feeling that people are dealing with, those are normal, right? We make that to be really, really normal, and we also try to get the survivors to understand that, you know, they are not alone. They're not the only one that these things have happened to. But I think one of the biggest things about how we can start to change this is by educating the families. Like I said before, most of our people are struggling with it. These are collectivist cultures, right? And it's like everything I do affects everybody else. And if I do good, that is normal. But if something bad happens, it becomes like a really bad thing, and it's about everybody else, right? So I think a lot of education has to go into this, and it has to be gentle, because like everybody has been through trauma. These are cultures that have been through a lot of traumas, not just from women, violence against women. They've been through a lot of other traumas, and that affects it. But also there's the traditions that we come up with. Like when something happens to one of the family members, it's reflected through the whole community. My one of my clients just told me a story recently about how this is a person who's been through a lot of trauma right from the beginning. Like her mom was going through domestic violence, the children also going through the violence as well from the dad, right? And she finally came here to Canada. Unfortunately, she met a person, and she went through intimate violence also. So she's a survivor in so many levels, right? So finally, and this person that she met here is someone from our own culture who was abusing her. Recently, she's been through therapy and she's recovering a little bit, but recently she met someone from a different culture, a different race, who is a really good person, and she wants to marry him. But the family is blaming her. Like, first of all, like the mom, for one of the first reaction the mom gave her was silence. She did not talk to her for 2 days. When she finally spoke to her on the third day, she was saying really painful, hurtful things. And everybody's telling her, oh, you really hurt your mother, you're hurting all of us, you're shaming us. What was happening to you with this person who was from our culture, was abusing you, was just normal, right? Like, and as a woman, you're supposed to be able to bear this kind of thing. So I'm thinking that there's a lot of education that needs to go into this. There's a lot of understanding that we need to do. A lot of changes has to happen on so many levels. It's not just about protecting the victim. It's also about educating everybody. It's the other thing that I'm thinking about is, because there are expectations, right? Like children feel this really heavy burden that they have, because the families teach the kids that when you grow up, it's now your turn to give back to the family. You don't live your own life, you have to give back to the family. So even this has to change as well, right? Like parents need to really parent, not expecting the kids to parent them at the end of the day. So in addition to that, of course, I think we've talked about it, language, safety, being believed, reducing the shaming, making the systems to be safer for these people to speak out, like the police, the reporters, like all these things need to start changing. And I think the work that needs to be done right from, we do not only therapy, but we also do groups, try to connect with the families, and we try to just focus on the survivors. All this language and all this work that we do should be focused on the survivors' needs, right? Like, what does help look like for the survivor, not for the system, not for the people who are trying to help them. Yeah, sorry, that's a bit convoluted. I was trying to summarize what I've been thinking about.
Oh no, that's very rich territory, and it's that layered challenge. People exist within community, right? People exist within connections. People exist within these webs of connections, and we can't interact with someone and presume that they're a sole actor, right? That they're not affected by the others around them and by the reactions of others around them, and that I think, Margaret, what you were talking about, that educational piece, and Molly has touched on this, and Leslie and Janet as well, that educational piece for the wider community. This isn't an issue an issue we solve one-to-one, right? This is an issue we solve in community and through that wider education. I'm wondering about the role of those people we call allies, and how people who are not at the center of that initial harm can support survivors without overshadowing their voices. Or Janet, you had talked earlier about people's stories being stolen, and that happens in all kinds of communities. I'm wondering, what's the role for allies in all of this? Janet, maybe you could start on that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was thinking about is that there are, from our world, there's young people who maybe still are home with families and have that really good support, but the families have sheltered them because they are worried that if they go out into the community, that somebody is going to assault them or rape them or harm them in some way. So they keep them fairly close there, but they don't always provide the education for their kids to understand that there are healthy relationships. And so someone who may be abused, maybe not want to engage in a sexual activity, but it wouldn't be considered like the violence of a stranger. It's might be somebody who's actually in the person's life to help take care of them. And I think that that's where, for one thing is that education of our young people, however we're able to do that, to say that's not okay. But if you're said it's not okay and you need to tell somebody, and you tell somebody and they don't believe it, or they keep you even closer so that you can't go out. I think that there's, that there is that community there, that it's one approach. I think that young people who have left really bad situations and find themselves alone on the streets, I think that's a very difficult group of people to meet. That maybe it's better to be raped and assaulted than not having any place to live. When they're thinking what they're giving up for, just to have a place, just to have some kind of shelter, and that too. Like how do we meet that? But it is like society sometimes has this opinion of people with intellectual disabilities that they're not attractive. So who would want to have sexual relationships with them? Like it's so that they're not believed, because they say, like, well, someone wouldn't want you because you're not attractive, and whether that's a physical disability or how they talk or how they dress or whatever it is, it's they've been discriminated against at such a low level, and they have internalized that discrimination. So if somebody wants them, of course it's because they love them, and so there's so many layers, and I think the more we look at it, the deeper we understand it, but knowing that there's so much more to keeping people safe. And people sometimes are in situations where they simply cannot keep themselves safe, but they need to be free from blame, that it wasn't anything that they did, that the person who did that to them, they were the ones that did something wrong. It wasn't about where you were or whatever. That's, not where you dress or anything like that. It's not okay. And I think that message needs to be given to people from as early an age as possible.
In a way, I think Margaret maybe touched on this a little bit earlier as well. In a way, it's resisting the urge to ask why. Resisting,
Yeah.
that why question is one to hold in your to hold yourself back in that moment, because it's such a shame laden question to ask, right? Yeah. Leslie, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that role of allies in supporting survivors within your community.
For sure. Thank you. Yeah, this was a really big question that we had here at MCIC and also within our community too, because unfortunately situations like of rape and assault do occur in communities. But allies have a crucial role to play in supporting survivors of violence, but they also need to do it in a way that does not overshadow the voices of those who are seeking help. I think there are several effective strategies that allies can do to help survivors. So listen actively. Allies should prioritize listening to survivors without interruption. This means creating a safe space for survivors to share their experiences. Oh, one moment, please. I'm just getting a work call. And so it gives the opportunity for survivors to share their experiences and feelings and ensure that they're feeling heard and validated. So I think active listening is very, very important. Also elevating survivors' voices. So rather than speaking on behalf of survivors, I think that allies should amplify the voices in conversations and advocate for their needs. So this can involve sharing survivor stories. However, you need their consent. That's very, very important. And also promoting their perspectives, but ensuring that you're not changing the context of the story. That's very important as well. I think educating ourselves, so taking the initiative to educate ourselves about gender-based violence, its impacts, and the challenges faced by survivors. This understanding could help us, respond in a more appropriately and effective manner in supporting survivors. And then, offering support. So allies can provide supports by helping survivors access resources such as counseling, legal assistance, and safe housing. I think that's very important because, we want to support survivors and ensure that, they have the capacity to reach out. Some people may not have that capacity or may be too ashamed to reach out. So we as allies can do that, make those connections. And it really does help uplift that burden that survivors are carrying. And being mindful of language. So allies should use language that is respectful and affirms survivors' experiences. So this includes avoiding terms implying doubt or shame, and using empowering, clear language that validates their narratives. And I think that's very important. So just getting rid of those barriers, unaffirming language can develop those barriers for survivors, and it can be very challenging for survivors to get through those barriers. So just keeping in mind that, but these are just some strategies that allies can participate in a meaningful way to support and respect and uplift survivors. So fostering a collaborative environment where survivors feel empowered and to share their experience and advocate for themselves, I think is very important.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Molly, you talked about the importance of people within the queer community seeing their stories on the page. To build on something that Leslie was saying about the importance of allies educating themselves, I mean, reading widely is another, reading widely of others' experiences is another way for allies to sort of do some of that self-education along the way. I wonder what other thoughts you might have on how allies can support survivors without overshadowing or subverting their voices.
Well, one very important thing regarding that is to ensure that you are supportive. You need to make sure that when you're dealing with someone's queer identity, that you respect it. And even if someone, perhaps you don't understand exactly what they're going through and you don't exactly understand their experiences, you need to ensure that you give them your support and you show them that you appreciate them. Especially in regards to situations of gender-based violence, people may not feel safe. Especially with queer people, they might lose out on a lot of communities. As an example, many people like who come out as trans, for example, lose the support of their parents. And that means you need to ensure that people can feel safe around you and they feel like they can come to you in times of need. So really what I see as most important is just that emotional availability, making sure that people feel heard and as Leslie said, active listening. You need to make sure that you don't speak for someone, you let them speak more and you hear them when they say things. You don't just say, oh, that's the system does what it does. No, you need to consider what's their perspective. Think about how you would act in their shoes and then try to consider that rather than just focusing, and also like make sure that you focus on someone else's feelings rather than your feelings about their situation. Because whatever opinion you might have, what is most important is the person who is suffering and ensuring that they are heard, that they are listened to, and that their story is being told as they would wish to tell it. And of course, with their permission.
Great. Thanks, Molly. Margaret, you've spoken about some of this in terms of the stories that the experiences that you're hearing in dealing with people in counseling situations, and I'm wondering what advice you have for others who might be hearing a story for the first time, hearing someone's experience for the first time, what steps they can take to be supportive, because we don't all come to the table with the training that the people around this table have.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I guess we just need to be able to, not to personalize what we hear, right? To be able to hold somebody else's story without identifying with it. I think that is really important. And this again takes, education. It takes, I think, a lot of acceptance, being able to just take what people are bringing without judgment, without putting them through other lenses that we may have. Just being really, really open. And this takes a lot of, I guess, humility, because I think you have to come from a humble and very curious place to be able to really sit with what somebody's bringing without putting it through any lenses that you might have, So I guess that also asks people not to have, like we have societal, I guess, narratives about people. We otherwise other people, so we already judge people from just seeing them, and when we hear things, then we put what we hear through that. So I guess the biggest thing is to be just curious and to be open and to just remember that it's about the other person, not about us.
Right.
And I hope that that might take, I guess, a lot of education, a lot of training, and that is what we need to do for society, to be able to hold what we create, because these crimes happen within society. So society should be able to train people, to educate people, to make these things available so that people are aware and they're actually able to be there in a way that is helpful to survivors.
Yeah. It's that I think also perhaps part two is being comfortable with a little bit of silence sometimes, right?
Exactly.
That sometimes we try to rush in and fill the space, and sometimes we fill the space with ourselves when we just need to hold space. Yeah.
And sometimes we, in addition to that's great space. I think giving people space and being able to just sit in that discomfort. The person who has been through this the discomfort they're having is nothing compared to what I'm getting as a listener. So being able to sit with that, and also just not trying to put words in people's mouths, right? Like sometimes we're not comfortable with the story, so we are trying to reframe what they are saying. We are trying to tell it in a way that is comfortable, acceptable to society, or to those who might be hearing. But this is about the person who actually went through this.
Mm-hmm. The other level of discomfort is organizational discomfort, right? That the organizations that we work for don't have a framework, don't have ways of navigating this. And I wonder, Janet, you've talked a little bit about the work that your organization and your group of organizations is trying to do. What kind of steps as organizations do we need to take to own the discomfort, I guess, and to yeah.
And I think when I think about some of the organizations that it's revealed that something has happened, they go into that mode of, yes, wanting to somehow like keep the person safe and stuff, but it's like, how do we protect our agency as well too? So there's some of that. And I think that when Margaret, when you said about needing to just be with somebody, be uncomfortable because you're hearing something, but let that be. And I think that that's organizational. That is something that has to be built into the culture of an organization. I don't think it's easy, but I think that once you realize that that's what you have to do, you have to be able to accept that, yeah, bad things happen to people. And if we're really going to support them, we need to also take care of ourselves, because that's, we need to take care of other people. But believing that something can happen under the roof that you thought was really safe for people, and let the people say, this is what makes me feel unsafe. This is my story. And people need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah. Leslie, what about in your community and in your organization? What kinds of steps do you think organizations can take to be, to welcome the discomfort, I guess?
For sure, thank you. The Manitoba Council for International Cooperation, we work towards inclusion through a JEDI committee. So our JEDI committee stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So Cooperation Canada had an advisory group back in 2021, and it introduced the anti-racism framework. So that framework is what our JEDI committee uses in order to open up dialogues, in order to be there for our colleagues, and to work towards inclusivity within our organization. So we are committed to measuring and understanding and addressing the ways in which employees experience the workplace unequally from an anti-racist lens. We commit to recognizing and eliminating racism in our advocacy, communications, and knowledge sharing activities, as well as using our platform to support an anti-racist agenda. And we commit to implementing anti-racism efforts into the design and delivery of context-specific, community-driven projects and programming. So that's what MCIC does. However, in our community, we are working towards developing, I say we, me as a part of the community, but there are programs, and in the way that we approach arising situations within our community. So they are trying to change the policies that were previously implemented that had that colonial context into a more holistic approach that incorporates an Indigenous lens. So they're trying to create a more inclusive and understanding narrative for people within our Indigenous community. Now, I could only speak for Opaskwayak Cree Nation because that's right, where I'm from, but I do know that a lot of different bands or reservations are starting to develop their own ways, which fosters that inclusivity and equity for all, and working towards justice and diversity within their communities.
Right. Terrific. Thank you, Leslie. Molly, when you look within within an educational setting, that university setting, what sort of gaps do you see there, and what do you hope for in terms of what an educational organization can do to support survivors without overshadowing them?
I think one of the most important points from an organizational perspective, especially in an educational perspective, is to leave an openness and availability, specifically like ensuring that, for example, there are systems in place for survivors to be able to come to the institution and to be able to share their story and to be heard, and to ensure that the people in those positions who are overseeing that have expertise and have training to be able to handle those situations. Because even if someone has the best intentions, it doesn't matter if they're not properly trained, if they don't have that kind of experience, if they don't have their own educational basis to be able to understand and aid those surviving. And one of the also most important things regarding an educational situation is that at post-secondary institutions, there is an inherent power imbalance between the leaders of the organization, between the professors and students. And need to ensure that there is not a massive barrier between the students and the people who can help them, and ensuring that, for example, there are counseling services and all of that, so that way, even if they struggle to reach out to, say, like a security team, or they struggle to reach out to any form of that, they can at least get mental health services that could then lead into them possibly reaching out and making sure that the educational organization is able to help them in what ways they can.
Thank you. I see we're at the top of the hour, so I know that we'll need to wrap things up. But I want to thank everyone for their thoughtful remarks, for their insights. I want to thank each of you for bringing yourselves to the table and having a conversation that these are difficult things to talk about, and I think it's so valuable for us to be willing to sit in our own discomfort, and to make that space for the conversation. So thank you for being part of this important conversation, and thank you to Valerie for organizing this evening. So thank you, Valerie.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks, Kim, so much for guiding this discussion. I guess, first of all, Leslie, I was going to say that the acronym JEDI is really cool. Thanks for sharing that with us. So from everyone speaking, okay, first, actually, before I say a few words, if you have any questions, I know we're out of time, but if you do have a question, you can put it into the chat and we can try and answer it quickly before we close. So yeah, you feel free to do that as I talk. If I see something, I'll have it addressed before we close. So I was going to say that some of the things that, well, obviously everything that everyone's talked about has been amazing, has been so educational, and I appreciate all of you panelists. But some of the things that stood out to me were like when Leslie was talking about how the best way to, or one of the ways that we can offer support is by making sure that we're having long-term commitments. We have cultural sensitivity, and I think that's very important in all our various communities. We've talked about Indigenous groups, we've talked about people with disabilities, disabled communities, disabled people, we've talked about queer communities, and all racialized people. So it's very important to make sure that we have or maintain cultural sensitivity, and that we are considering that all the efforts that are being put in are done through community, because community is so important. As my mom said, I really can't say her name, so if you hear me talking about my mom, it's Margaret. So as she said, that it takes a village. The same way we say it takes a village for raising kids, it also takes a village for healing. And so that's where we come in, whether you're a survivor yourself, or whether you have people in your circles who are survivors. For us, we are part of that village, and there's so many different ways for us to support them, right? It can be through just educating ourselves through literature, or even just getting involved in various ways. So just to wrap up, thank you all for being here this evening. To our panelists, thank you for sharing your stories, your insights. Your voices remind us that there's still work that needs to be done, and it takes our collective strength to harness. We can harness our collective strength to create change. Kim, thank you so much for guiding this conversation. And to everyone who has been able to join us here this evening, thank you for bringing your attention. Thank you for bringing your commitment to this space. Conversations like this are the seeds of change. And as you leave tonight, I hope you carry forward what we've discussed and think about how you can contribute to a world free of violence against women and people who identify as women, and whether that's through advocacy or education or just being supportive of the survivors in your circle. Every action matters. So thanks again, and have a safe and reflective evening.